Before we start, I'd like to say that if you do have a question, I do not mind being interrupted, especially when we're dealing with this material. So if you have a question, you can ask it at any point, and I think that'd be a good idea. So if you want clarification, or if I should spend more time on something, that would be great. As Dale said, my name's Corey, and what we're going to be doing today is we're going to tear apart the Havex malware. First, we'll kind of talk about it in general. Then we're going to get down into the ones and zeros and the nitty-gritty, into the weeds, and see what the Havex malware does and how it operates. So that's what we're going to be spending the next hour or so doing. So we'll start with a Havex overview. There's been a lot of media attention on Havex. And so first we're going to talk about sort of that side of things. So what is Havex? Havex is part of a larger operation by a group that sort of goes by two names, depending on which party is naming them, between Crouching Yeti and Energetic Bear is what they're called. That's an APT campaign, or these actors. These are the individuals who created this malware to work with their system. As Dale said, the origin of the malware is an important question, and with Havex, as compared to some other malware that we've seen in general in the past, is there are less indicators of origin. Because sometimes you will find text in the native language of the people who created it, for example, or other indicators to tell you where the malware came from. Havex targets industrial control systems with at least part of the malware that is in operation. And as Dale said, that is still unusual. We don't see that very much with the general malware that is being run or seen in the world. And that's one of the things that makes Havex so interesting, at least to us from an ICS community standpoint. And so that's why I'm looking at it, and that's why I'm here, and that's why at S4 we're interested in finding out what Havex does. So in terms of, Havex is malware that uses three primary delivery techniques to spread. The big one that caught so much attention are the Trojanized software installers. What happened was some legitimate companies that do business in industrial control systems had their websites compromised due to a vulnerability in their content management system that they use. And that exploit was used to, the attackers took the installers for the legitimate software and put the malware in them and then put them back on the website. And so anybody who went to the website to use the legitimate ICS software was actually downloading an infected malware installer in addition to the software. And there was also a spear phishing campaign and watering hole attacks with attacks coming to the clients who browse to a specific site. In a way, Trojanized software installers are sort of a watering hole attack. It's called that because the attack comes from the place where your customers go, which is your website or something like that. So rather than spreading the attack out to people, they actually come and get it from you, which is a little bit interesting. With Havex, which is perhaps another interesting point, is unlike Stuxnet, Havex doesn't use any O-day, any zero-day exploits. For the most part, they're old exploits, old PDF type exploits that have been around for a while, or exploiting the Trojanized installers, in which case you just ran it, so they didn't need any sort of exploit. Yet, despite not using any zero days, it's still spread pretty effectively. So the Havex analysis that we did was conducted against the Havex Remote Access Trojan, or RAT. That appears as the Trojanized installer, as I mentioned. We use this MB Connect. If some people might be familiar with it, it's used for remote access to ICS systems. But the sample that I got was an infected installer for this product. And we're going to break the analysis down into two parts. We'll briefly talk about the command and control that happens with Havex. That's part of the main Havex system. But then the way that Havex works is it installs the Trojanized, or the remote access Trojan, the RAT, and then that process goes out to the attacker systems and downloads modules for execution. So the main Havex sits on the computer and then goes and gets extra modules to execute. So the installer itself, the Trojanized installer, when we set up the environment to monitor it, watching it execute, it uses a registry it adds a run key to the registry to create persistence so that through reboot and whatnot, Havex is still running on the computer. And then once it was ran, there are a certain number of domains that are used for command and control servers. In this particular instance, it tried to go to sinfulcelebs.freesexycomics.com, which is an easy one that sort of stands out because maybe it's a little unusual and provocative of a URL. But this is a C2 server, command and control. But it does not belong to the attackers. They compromised this server and ran their command and control on top of it. So here is a screenshot from the registry comparison tool called Redshot. It's a pretty fantastic tool. What it will do is you can run it once. It will take a snapshot of the registry on a Windows system. Then you can execute whatever you'd like. In this case, it was the Trojanized installer. And then you do another snapshot, and then it compares the two. And here is the result from the comparison. And the key of interest is, can you see that? Yeah, the pointer does show up. Is this one right here, where it inserts a run entry. But there's a lot more things that it does, most of which are legitimate from the MB Connect software that I installed. But some of them are not. So the command and control servers that Havex uses are comprised, like I said, of web servers belonging to other individuals or other companies. Some of them more seedy than others, as we saw with that other URL. But it is other people's web servers that they've compromised. The thing of note, perhaps, in using other people's servers, the attackers did not attempt to secure them in terms of what the command and control servers were doing and the kind of downloadable modules that they put up on those command and control servers for the Havex RAT to execute. So we were able to get quite a few samples that way, and you could possibly play with that stuff to try and influence the attackers or take control of the command and control yourself, which is a very interesting topic. And we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later when we talk about incubation. But we're not going to talk about that now because our focus is going to be on the ICS-related components of Havex. Okay, and this is an example of the command and control server. This was just, you could just browse to it, and here's a list of the, a list of the files that are there. And I guess it's, these are samples or modules that the Havex RAT will download and execute. But the reason that we're talking about this at S4, an ICS conference, is because Havex, one of the downloadable modules for Havex, which caught media attention, was a module that does OPC scanning. So this is the ICS part to Havex, which was of interest, which we hadn't really seen in the public or caught public media attention since Stuxnet. So let's take a step up and talk about OPC. Most people in the room probably are familiar with OPC. It's one of the most common protocols, and it is, for one, a good way to determine whether or not the system that has been infected is an ICS system. If OPC is present, then you know that there is ICS components in the system that you've compromised. OPC is the common bridge between protocols. It translates between protocols and quite often passes data between security zones. So if you have an isolated ICS network, often OPC will be used to get data out of that isolated network into a business network or the data for use somewhere else. And that is why it is interesting to attackers. OPC is also sometimes used for process control. So if an attacker is able to execute OPC and mess with the OPC protocol, they may be able to control the process, which is why OPC is important to an attacker. We talked about what OPC does, but in terms of why an attacker would want it, obviously if you have a protocol that's talking to both your isolated network and your business network, then that, from an attacker's perspective, is a wonderful place to be able to control, because then you have access to both of the networks. And it can be difficult to get to the isolated ICS networks. And so that's why OPC would be valuable. Additionally, OPC tags might have information about the process itself, which attackers could be interested in if they're trying to figure out who you are, what systems they've infected, what data they have available, the nature of the system that they're on. And additionally, attackers might be interested in the version number of the OPC in order to determine exploitability, to see whether or not they could get control in another module. As we've seen in ICS and we've been talking about, we are often very behind on our patches. So a vulnerable OPC server is a common thing for a system to be behind on Windows patches or patches for the application layer of the OPC that's running. And an attacker could be interested in that information because that's how you would take advantage of and exploit that system. So we'll be talking about what this specific module does, but an attacker's interested in, one, knowing about your OPC environment, and two, possibly being able to control that environment. So when conducting the analysis, we set up a laboratory at Digital Bond Facilities where we could do the analysis of this malware. There are a few challenges when dealing with malware in ICS environments, which we had to deal with and overcome, in that ICS equipment may not be virtualizable. Like we talked about yesterday at OT Day and virtualization, sometimes you have hardware that you can't virtualize. And so when creating an environment to analyze malware, that could be a challenge. And later today, we're going to be talking about malware analysis environments in a little more detail. The other aspect is that debugging and monitoring ICS equipment can be difficult because it isn't virtualizable, and it may not run on a Windows system, for example. Debugging and monitoring embedded systems can be challenging. You can use things like JTAG ports and other options, serial debugging, to try and get output from these embedded systems, but it is a challenge. So the OPC components in the environment that we created for this analysis mainly consisted of 3 systems: a Win2K8, a Matricon OPC simulator server is what I used for the OPC server itself, if anybody is familiar with Matricon stuff. And then I had a Windows XP machine that I was using for the malware execution. And then a Windows 2008 domain controller, because Decom can be very, very frustrating, just to get working in general. Probably one of the most challenging aspects was just getting OPC and Decom to talk, I guess. But those are the 3 systems that we use primarily in the environment. And so we just talked about what OPC is, why an attacker would want OPC, and then we talked a little bit briefly about the OPC analysis environment, but now we're going to get into it. We're going to actually pick this OPC module apart and see how it works. So the module that we analyzed, there are a few different samples for the OPC module. They all have exactly the same code in them, the same, only slightly different changes in the resource section of the binary, which we'll get to in a minute. But here are the hashes of the sample that we used. So when conducting malware analysis, or any binary analysis really, any reverse engineering that you're going to do, there are 2 primary techniques: dynamic analysis and static analysis. Dynamic analysis is the process of letting the software run and watching what it does. And static analysis is the process of picking the binary open and looking at what's in the binary itself. And so we'll start with dynamic analysis. So here are a few of the tools that we used for analyzing the system. Redshot, as I showed earlier in the screenshot, was useful for seeing what changes to the registry the malware has made. Sysinternals from Microsoft, everybody's probably familiar with those, is very useful for watching what a process is doing, particularly the Procmon tool on a Windows system. And then additionally, monitoring the network is very important. So I set up a DNS server and some code that would answer every network request. So on the malware analysis network, if whatever this malware tried to do, it would get an answer, to put it simply, I guess, was the idea is to try create an environment where that malware can thrive. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later when we talk about incubation. And then virtualization, as I mentioned, and snapshots are really useful when you're analyzing malware or any binary dynamically, because you want to be able to take a snapshot and then later revert to that snapshot so you can go from the exact state that you were. So for instance, I set up my Windows system, I take a snapshot, I execute my malware, I watch what it did, and then I go back to the snapshot of my clean system and do it again. Perhaps changing some things about the environment to see if the malware executes differently. And then, of course, a debugger for being able to step through the instructions of the executable that you're analyzing is also very important. So this is Redshot analysis of the OPC module itself. First, I'll be talking about from a dynamic perspective what the module does, but where we're really going to get into the details are in later in the presentation. So as you can see, comparatively to that other Redshot picture that I put up there, this doesn't do much. And mostly that's all from, all of those are just from executing the system. The module itself didn't change anything about the registry. But Procmon, on the other hand, was very useful for seeing what this particular malware module was attempting to do. It's a little difficult to read. You'll be able to get the slides. And again, I'm going to go into this in more detail. But you can see Procmon will show you files that are being created at the bottom here. You can see that it's creating a temp file in the file system. And Procmon will show you all the stuff, the system calls that the malware is attempting to make. And all of these tools together help you build the picture of what this malware is actually attempting to do. And then, let's see. Analysis of the network communications is very useful as well. You execute your suspected malware. You watch what happens on the network. This is how watching the DNS on the network is where I saw the free sexy comics that the malware was attempting to go out to. That's the Havex rat was attempting to use this. These communications are from the OPC module itself. And you can see here directly in the text is, this is a screenshot from Wireshark is the tool, which is a network analysis tool. But you can see OPC information in this in the network communications that are occurring between the systems. So the dynamic analysis was done to get an idea of what the malware was doing. You watch it for a while, you try and see what it does, and it helps you start to develop a picture of what the system, of what the executable is doing. It is very important when analyzing malware or any executable to intertwine with static analysis. Both techniques are very valuable. So dynamic, and each has its pluses and minuses. Dynamic analysis is useful for getting past tricky sections of a binary, perhaps. If you're trying to understand what a section does, you don't necessarily have to dig through each instruction in the disassembly. You can just run it and see. But fortunately for us, the last point on this slide, this OPC module is not difficult to reverse engineer. It doesn't have obfuscation techniques or anything, so static analysis in the case of this OPC module is going to be our greatest asset. That's going to be where we spend most of the time talking about what this malware does. Because when doing dynamic analysis, you won't see the malware do anything that it wasn't planning on doing, if that makes any sense. This is where having the right environment is important. But for instance, Stuxnet would not execute its payload unless it was in the correct environment. And so if I don't have the correct environment and I'm executing the malware, it may not do what it was designed to do. And the way to detect that is through static analysis. And especially since this is easy to reverse engineer, that's what we're going to do. You may also have tricky things like, here's things that malware will do to make it more difficult to analyze dynamically. Things like detect a virtual environment and alter its behavior, or prevent or alter its behavior if there's a debugger attached, that type of a thing. All those are, it's possible to circumvent it's sort of an arms race. You're fighting against the attackers to try and get the malware to execute its payload, and the malware authors are trying to get their malware to only execute its payload on the intended target to make it more difficult to analyze. So you've got that struggle between analysts of malware and authors of malware, but in this case, we don't have to worry about that, which is convenient for us. So the main tools we're going to be talking about for static analysis, where we're going to rip this binary apart, we're going to look at the gears inside, see how it works. The main tools that we're going to use are, I like just Linux command line tools, are very useful for analyzing any binary. CFF Explorer is a tool for analyzing Windows binaries. And IDA Pro is the big one, which is the reverse engineering tool that we're going to use. So here is the first thing that I do almost always. If I have something that I'm trying to analyze, a binary, if it's malware or if it's a challenge for a capture the flag game, is strings. Because strings will give you, what that does is it's a tool that looks for text in a binary in GU, and it will give you all kinds of useful output often. And so even here, here's the strings output that you can see. There are some interesting things that immediately pop out, where it says start finging of LAN hosts, start finging of OPC servers. So right away, as soon as you run strings, you understand that this is ICS targeted malware immediately. And that's a very useful high-level way to look into a system. Start thinking of OPC tags. So just right away from strings, we know that, okay, this not only is sort of looking for OPC servers, this malware is probably going to actually talk to these servers and get tag lists and that type of a thing. So that's a good clue there. And then this one down here is a base 64 string that decodes to 131212, which keep that in your mind because that's going to be important later. So we got all this useful information just from strings. It's the best malware analysis tool there is. And then the things like the file command is a Linux tool that tells you what a file is. So the malware sample that I had wasn't called a specific DLL. It was just a string. So file is probably the first thing that you actually run before strings, just to figure out what kind of file you're dealing with. The next tool we'll talk about is CFF Explorer, which is a useful tool for taking a Windows binary and seeing what it does. What are the components? What are the imports? So this screenshot shows us the imports that this DLL uses. So the OPC module is a DLL, Dynamic Link Library for Windows. And so the import directory for this shows us that it's using these Windows calls, which are going to be interesting later for looking for servers. And then we also have the export table, which shows us the functions that the DLL exports, because the first thing that you need to do if you're doing dynamic analysis is you have to be able to run your malware. And so this was a DLL, so first I had to be able to execute this malware, which is fortunately pretty easy. The run DLL export is the function that we want to call. Pretty straightforward, so we just run it from the command line with this command. And the last tool that I mentioned was IDA Pro, which is the tool for doing reverse engineering. Outside of debuggers, this is where you spend most of the time when you're trying to analyze a binary for everything. If you're trying to analyze what malware does, you use IDA Pro. If you're trying to look for vulnerabilities, you use IDA Pro. if you're trying to solve a tricky capture the flag problem, which requires analyzing binary, you use IDA Pro. It's a fantastic tool. So we're going to talk about the OPC module code flow. Let's figure out what this binary does. What does the OPC module do? What are its goals? What are its hopes and dreams? So this is, on the left is, well, I don't know if it's easier if I just go to IDA. This may be more visible. Oh, no, I can't zoom. Okay, so here is what we're looking at is the run DLL function, which is that first initial exported function. And what I've done is, as you go through a binary in IDA, you figure out what it does, and you're renaming functions to your own names. So a lot of these have my names, which indicate what they do. But in IDA, you can see sort of the general code flow. We're going to get into all the details in a bit, so it's not super important to pay attention to everything on this slide. But on the left, we have the run DLL, which is the main function. And then on the right, I have a section from the OPC function, which does most of the OPC stuff. So let's get into the details for each of these. So the first thing that the malware does when it executes is, in the CFF Explorer, we'll show you this, but there's a resource section of the file that is an encrypted container that contains a configuration file for the malware. And that's what this is. So I wrote just a little quick JavaScript thing because I like JavaScript, and everybody who does this type of reverse engineering likes Python. So I use JavaScript when I want to because it makes me feel pretty. What the resource section is a configuration file, as I said, which is just binary goo. It's not understandable as it exists in the binary. But remember from what we put in the back of our minds before is that 1312312 is the XOR key that was used to quote-unquote encrypt the resource section. So if we XOR that resource section with this key, which was in the binary that we saw through strings very easily, then we find out that the resource section is a bzip2 library, which bzip2 archive, excuse me, which we extract to get this data. And what the configuration file, we may talk about that more, but it has this data in it, and then this is an encryption key down here, which we'll get into when we get to the end of what the module does. So after the OPC module starts to execute, it decrypts the configuration file, looks at the file, and then it starts to create the temporary files that it's going to use as it's executing. So this particular screenshot is from multiple runs. Each time you run the module, it creates a temporary file that has 0 data that's used for a lock. And then it creates a temporary file that it puts data in, relevant to what the particular, relevant to the actions that the module is taking. So one of the other things that is fortunate for us as analysts about this malware is that it creates a debug log for us that tells us all the details of what it is doing. After it executes, it deletes that log, but it creates it while it's running, which, since we are in control of our environment, we can stop it from deleting that file at the end and get the full details of what the system was doing. So it's very convenient that the malware authors left their debug information in there for us so we can see what the malware is doing. So that was very nice of them. Trying to hack our OPC servers is not nice, though. So this is that run log that I was talking about. It has, well, I'll show that in a minute. But it has details about what was going on. Say the program was started at in time, and then the output from the modules, which you recognize this from strings output. And the program pretty much tells you its code flow conveniently. So the first thing it does is start finging of LAN hosts. That is a typo that the malware authors have in there. It finds the two systems that I have on the network and sees that one of them is the Matricon OPC simulator and outputs that and then starts looking at the tags on the server, etc. So that log gives us full information, but this is just a piece to the puzzle. You can't totally trust this since this is what the attackers created. So a clever attacker may put false information in a debug log file, and it might be funny to see what the analysts think of false information. So the code flow of the module, which we could see from that config file and which we see from dynamic analysis and which we see from static analysis, keep using these different techniques, shows that the OPC module is looking at the tags on the OPC server. It's going out and using the Decom interface calls to get the tag list from the OPC servers. And here is that the module or the overview code from that section where you can see the string. So here's where they reference that string as they're writing the call, and then going into what I call the WNet enum functions, which are Windows API functions for looking for servers, which is what Decom is, which is not a good way to communicate, just in my opinion. But it's been around a while, and OPC has been around a long while too. So down here are just Microsoft diagrams for how Decom works. It can be interesting, but we're not going to go into too much detail about how Decom works itself here. But that's what the module uses for OPC communication. So these are the calls over on this side, on the left here, is our co-initialize X and co-create instance X, which are the Decom calls, which I think I have pulled up here. So this is from, as you're doing this type of analysis, you're going to find that MSDN, the Microsoft documents, are useful in trying to figure out if, I personally am not all that familiar with Windows API calls and how to program something in Decom. So I had to rely on research and figure out how the Decom was working. So this is useful to me to figure out, okay, so it's calling this co-initialize X function. What does that mean? It's and the co-create instance function. But what this is doing is using Decom to look for the OPC servers. And then the WNet enum are also available up there, which starts to enumerate the Windows network resources and continue that enumeration with further calls. But these are useful where you can see the arguments that are given here on the MSDN, and then you can come over to your disassembly and see the arguments right here. IDA is really nice, often where it can put these comments in there to tell you what the arguments are. So after it enumerates the OPC servers, then as we saw in the log file, which turns out to be true in this case, then we're going to look for OPC tags, or the malware is going to look for OPC tags, which is actually probing the ICS system. So it goes beyond just trying to figure out what ICS systems are there and goes into actually probing and looking at the tags that exist on this OPC server. And then what it does is take that information and put that in a log file with the name of the server. So this is the output log from the analysis that the malware did of my test OPC environment, which included, as we saw, a Matricon OPC, which I was running on a system called Bob's Laptop. So this is the name of the computer that I was running it on. Here's a list of all the tags, which, as we discussed earlier, could be very useful to an attacker. And then what it does in the code is it takes that information and packs it all up into an encrypted container. So back, it's maybe a ways back there, but this encryption key down here is used to take the log information that we saw that it grabbed from the OPC tags right here. It's used to take that, encrypt it, put it in a nice little container, package it up, and then it leaves it on the temporary file system for the Havex rat to take and put back on the command and control systems. The OPC module itself doesn't do any sort of outside communication to any command and control. Its job is to look for the OPC servers, grab all their tags, package it up nice and neat, and let the Havex rat take care of it from there. So the file is divided up into, I sort of dissected it here so that we could see the highlight. Hopefully the colors show up. Between length field, the RSA ID, block size, and then the container is actually encrypted with triple des, which is copied and pasted into the code for this malware. So the other thing that you get by running strings is you see strings like, you see strings that are directly taken out of the source code for encryption libraries like triple des, which is a common thing that happens because they're not going to use any sort of dynamic loading or anything in malware. Everything should be packaged up because they want it to run. So they just copy and pasted that in there. And so the functions that are in the malware are executing this encryption with the initialization vector. And then the rest of the file is the encrypted OPC information that the Havex rat is going to take. So in summary for the code flow, again, we'll take a step back. In summary of the code flow, Havex rat infects the system through a Trojanized installer or a phishing attack. It downloads modules from the C2 servers, from command and control, from freesexycomics.com, grabs those modules. One of those modules is an OPC module, which had the hashes that we saw earlier, which has a few tasks that it executes. First, it creates our temporary files, where it's going to put that stuff after decrypting the configuration. It scans for OPC servers. It enumerates the OPC tags on those servers using Windows Decom calls. It saves that information to a temporary file. It encrypts that temporary file and packages it up for the Havex rat to take and send out to command and control. That's our summary of our code flow, which we figured out by all of the analysis techniques that we talked about. So you can imagine why an attacker would want the OPC information. We talked about that. The interesting parts about this malware are that it seems to be, judging by our code flow analysis, it does not attempt any control. It does not attempt to create any set points. It does not attempt to exploit an OPC server. It does not attempt to control in any way. So it appears to be purely reconnaissance. And the conclusions that we come to, judging by that, all the analysis that we've done is that the module is purely reconnaissance, which is interesting because it raises questions, which we don't have answers to, including from where did the malware come, what purpose, is there a specific target that these attackers are looking for? The malware is spread through Trojanized installers to who knows where, but all that information about the OPC servers is packaged up, sent back to the attackers. Are they looking for someone specific? Are they just interested in OPC information around? All these are unknowns, but interesting questions. And a little bit later, when we talk about malware incubation, we'll talk about how you go about answering some of these questions, possibly. So at this point, I'd like to take any sort of questions, or if there are any components to it that you want to look at in more detail, we can use IDA right here or use some of our other tools. Yeah, in summary, looking at the Havex OPC module is interesting because it's one of the first public malware examples that targets ICS, and it's used for apparently only reconnaissance, which is interesting. So who knows what's coming down the road in the future.
Okay, do we have some questions?
This is Misaki from JP Cert. Thanks for a good talk. And I have rather two minor questions. For the first question is, how long does it take for the malware to be installed? And after the installation, how long does it take to send the log file to the server?
Okay, that's a good question. So the malware installation is immediate. As soon as the Trojanized installer that I download, as soon as I run that program, it's immediately infected and does. Maybe your question is, how long does it take to go out and get modules? Mm-hmm. That part, so the analysis of the Havex rat wasn't so much my focus. So that aspect I actually don't know the answer to. There are people who do, and afterwards I'll talk to you and get you specific names for who you can contact for that particular information probably. But my focus was on the module itself.
Okay, so when the rat is downloaded and installed to the affected system, the program, the malware automatically runs and does all the reconnaissance?
Yep. When you get the Trojanized installer, the malware runs and then attempts to communicate to get the downloadable modules from the command and control servers immediately.
Okay. And even if it doesn't find any OPC servers, does it send the log anyway to the C2? How the Havex rat takes the information and sends it to the C2, I did not analyze that part in terms of how the rat itself operates. Okay. So I don't know the answer to that question, sorry. Thank you very much.
Other questions?
Kayato Sekia from NEC. So as far as the OPC module goes, have you been able to look at all the code details? Is there any hidden portions that you weren't able to analyze?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that can happen, is there can be hidden sections of code that don't, I mean, so here's the list of all the functions that are in this program. And I can scroll here for a long time in terms of trying to figure out what the software does. So there are a few techniques that you can use to help identify in terms of how much of the executable has been executed when it's running. So you can do code coverage to see, which branches have been executed, which have not. But the binary includes a lot of, like I said, these third-party libraries. Like the entire encryption library for TripleS is in here. So there's a lot of code that doesn't get touched. So that technique can be a little bit difficult when they're just taking code from these open source projects and pasting it in there. So that was an important question when I knew that I was going to come up here and talk about it and make conclusions, and the conclusion being that I'm relatively sure that it's only reconnaissance, is to spend a lot of time digging through the specifics for the reverse engineering. So you can follow the code flow from RunDLL to see what kind of stuff it's doing. So I called this the main OPC module. If we go in there, you can kind of see here where it's opening up temp files, and you just kind of work through the code flow to figure out what the system is doing. So I guess the final answer to that question is I spent a lot of time trying to make sure that it wasn't doing something that was tricky or hidden. I didn't see it, or I don't think it is, but you're never sure with this type of stuff. Actually, I don't think there's any way to be concrete and say that there isn't some blob in here that turns into code and gets executed or whatnot in just the right environment. So you can probably, it's sort of a question of how much analysis do you do before you come to a relatively high percentage conclusion. And the other thing is that you can correlate with other researchers, because a lot of people, since this has been pretty big in the press, have been looking at it. And the conclusion that everybody seems to come to is that it's just reconnaissance. But that was one of the reasons that we were so interested in looking at it, is to make sure that it's not doing funky ICS type stuff. So hopefully that answered the question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. Could you please show me the encrypted OPC data, the slide of the encrypted?
Sure. This slide, you mean?
No, the colored one.
Oh,
Yeah,
this one. Okay.
And it looks to me that the encrypted triple disk key is, I would say, the ciphertext is too big for the triple disk key, isn't it?
The cipher, well, there's a lot more that's not on this screenshot, so it goes. There's a lot more detail that's not being shown right here, or a lot more file, if that's what you mean.
What do you mean? The triple disk key should be the size of 24 byte or something, and the colored region is too big for the size, isn't it?
So this whole file is encrypted with their public key,
Is it?
or the section down there.
So the public key is used, not the block ciphers.
I think he's looking, is the triple disk key actually outlines the 128-bit or whatever length that key is? Is there a box around it on your screen?
You mean just a part of the region is the triple disk key?
Let's see, we could also go to the disassembly, but I guess if it's okay, can we meet up afterward?
Okay.
And we can dig through it together?
I
And
see.
we'll go through the whole section of the code that does that, if that works. Because that's, yeah, I'm trying to think back to when I made that picture right there. So yeah, let's dig through it afterward, if that works for you.
Thank you very much.
Other questions? Kyuchi-san, did we have any on email? Okay, well, I think we should explore maybe a little bit this statement you've made a few times that this is only reconnaissance.
Sure.
Because if I were to maybe hone in on that a little bit, you're saying what you looked at is only reconnaissance.
Right.
So we don't know what they would connect to that rat to do in the future.
Right. This is only one module of many that exist, and there could be some that we haven't seen yet. In fact, actually, to that point, there are modules to this campaign, this APT campaign, that some people have seen and some people that are pretty rare. I guess I'll put it that way. One of the other modules that's of potential interest that I could not get a copy of to analyze was a module that scans for RS links and some other common ICS protocols besides OPC. So that sort of speaks to that point in that these types of modules are out there, but I can't analyze that one because I don't have a copy, and I've tried to reach out and get a copy from people, but it's in the Kaspersky report that module exists. And there are potentially modules that exist that nobody has copies of to analyze. So whether or not that means that there are other modules that do OPC actual attacks, it's very high possibility for sure. But whether or not they exist, we don't know. But it certainly could be possible, especially if you have something like this module that we know exists that is trying to do OPC reconnaissance.
So there's a few theories on this, and one of the theories is that someone just wanted to see if such a thing would work. And so they created Havex either to prove to their organization that such things could be done, or to test something out that then they might build on later to use. And you could say, okay, I can distribute this via spear phishing, I can distribute this via watering hole attack, and look at how many different OPC servers respond back to me with their information. So it may be nothing more than proof of concept or reconnaissance. But if it's actually a threat actor that has a goal of doing some damage or having the capability of doing damage in the future, this would be a first step. And what was really a little bit disappointing was the researchers, again, Kaspersky got a little bit more, but the researchers that have published information to date don't really have a lot of the follow-on communication with the command and control server. So once you get this OPC information from Havex, you, for example, could say, you could learn what OPC server it is. Is it a Matricon server? Is it a Kepware server? And you might want to attack a certain type of server. Or with the tags, you could be looking for a certain set of end sites, a certain set of SCADA or DCS sites that you want to compromise. And you might just throw away the rest and say, okay, now I've identified these, and now I'm going to download different payloads to do different things. One of the things that we've been very interested in is the choice of the 3 companies that distributed software with Havex in it. As there was a company that made basically cameras out of Switzerland, and then a very small ICS company in Germany, and the other one I think was in Belgium. And it would be very interesting to look at their customer lists and see if they had any customers in common. And if somebody was actually trying to get this Havex on a specific customer, and the spear phishing wasn't working, so they said, well, let me try to get it in through downloaded software. So if you were to draw a circle of the customers of those 3 companies, it would be very interesting to see where the intersection was. And so there's probably still a lot we don't know about the software and the campaign.
Right.
But even what we know is actually quite revolutionary in terms of ICS attacks.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of expand on a couple of those points in that one is the next step in how you analyze this. But first I'll talk about when you're, like Dale said, the intersection of the customers between these three Trojanized installers is possibly interesting. But there are other factors to consider as well in that they possibly intersect in their IT infrastructure. For instance, we know that the attackers were controlling these C2 servers by exploiting the web server. So it could be that these three companies were chosen because they all use the same content management system. And they happen to do ICS on top of that. So there are a lot of unknowns. If the intersection is more important with their customers, or if the intersection is more relevant to attacker opportunity, those are all really great questions to answer. And the way that you go about answering those, which is sort of the next step in this and pertains to the question that you asked about how long does it take the malware to go and get a module? What happens after the module is uploaded? And that's all part of sort of an incubation environment that we're interested in trying to create. So when I did this analysis, I have the laptop in my bag over there, but there's a lot of stickers on it that say malware, danger, do not connect to network, because it's unknown what kind of capabilities a malware has, so you do it in an isolated network. You don't let the malware go out and talk to the internet. It's simulated. So the malware didn't upload my OPC module to the internet. But that's sort of the next step and would be very interesting. As part of the incubation type thought of if we can create some sort of fingerprinted OPC server or environment so that we can let the malware run, it can collect information about our environment, send that to the attackers, and then see what the attackers do with it. See if they come back. See if anything else happens. That's all interesting and questions you can't answer by analyzing a binary in a static laboratory environment.
Any other questions? I guess the only other point that I'd add before we take a break is that there was some small impact to Japan of Havex. A number of Japanese systems were compromised. I can't remember if you were like 4th or 5th on the list of number of compromised computers by country. And there was one of the 3 vendors was distributing, had a Japanese subsidiary that was distributing the software. It appeared to be an attack based, going after European organizations based on their target of watering holes, but it did bleed over to the United States and Japan and everywhere else. And if you really want to look into this from a JP surge or incident response standpoint, it's very interesting to look at the reaction of the 3 companies to when they found this. One of them actually was very forthcoming and put out a notice right away. The other 2 waited until the reports became public and they had no choice and put out a notice. You probably would have much preferred, if you were a customer of the company, to be notified that you might have downloaded Havex right away rather than 3 to 6 months later. So it's something that it's a good example of one company really doing the right thing and the other 2 trying to avoid looking bad as long as possible, but actually harming their customers a little bit. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, let's take a 15-minute break. There's coffee and refreshments out there, and we'll come back at